Hey everybody, today we are joined by Terry Lee, head of 360 in games at Crunchyroll. Anyone who knows anything about anime here in the US should be familiar with Crunchyroll, which is primarily known for their popular anime streaming service. But today we're going to talk to Terry about number one, the market for anime-based games, two, the opportunity for anime games in markets outside of Japan, so opportunity and challenges for the Western markets. Three, who is the audience for anime IP? And finally, what are big upcoming anime IP games coming out soon, and specifically with respect to Crunchyroll? But before kind of diving in, Terry, can you talk to us a little bit about your background and what you do at Crunchyroll? For example, what is 360? What does that mean?
Sure. That's a good question. So 360 for Crunchyroll is basically all the business lines that surround the streaming video business. As you probably know, Crunchyroll started primarily as a streaming video subscription service. And over time, as part of the vision to bring a holistic anime experience to our fandom, we started getting into e-commerce, merchandise, events, and most recently games. So all of that folds under the broader what we call 360 umbrella. And then prior to running 360 at Crunchyroll, I was running China publishing at Riot Games, and then prior to that, I was running international for Crunchyroll. So a long time in anime and game space.
Maybe we could just start with by talking about the overall anime market for games. Now, certainly when we look at the size of the market, especially in Japan, we see that a lot of top grossing titles there are anime titles. So Fate Grand Order, Dragon Ball, Seven Deadly Sins, One Piece, Yu-Gi-Oh, and a lot more. But here in the US market, we're always seeing Dragon Ball Dokkan Battle in let's say the top 10, 15 grossing, but we haven't seen a lot more. So can you talk to us about the Japanese market or the US market, and maybe some thoughts in terms of why some of the bigger IP titles have not been as successful in the US market?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a bunch of factors here. I think firstly, I would say that traditionally speaking, the U.S. market has been more of an afterthought for a lot of Japanese publishers and developers, right? When they look at anime rights and when they look at anime games exploitation, it's primarily going to be Japan and then broader Asia. China is a huge market. Bilibili publishes a lot of these games, but into the West, unless there's traditionally a Japanese publisher that takes it over here, namely like Bandai, who takes a lot of top games, including Dragon Ball here. The rest of the field has largely been up to smaller developers, publishers, or a US publisher going and grabbing a game and taking it into the West. So I think from a strategic standpoint, it hasn't always been on par. And then once those games have come to the market in the West, a lot of times there isn't enough consideration around the audience suitability or adaptation, right? So a good game in Japan relies on a few things. One, of course, is IP recognition and overall awareness of that genre and that anime scape. The second is familiarity with the game format, a lot of the mechanics of the game, including the way that drop rates, gacha rates work, and overall feeling of the game. And I do think there's still a pretty big difference between how Western players view their game experience and how Eastern, namely Japan and Chinese players, view their game experience. And then if you layer in on top of that the fact that most IPs are not as well known, anime in general is not as broadly part of a societal norm in the West as it is in Japan, you're talking about a reduction in audience and potentially a mismatch in terms of audience expectations. So that's why I think most games that come over don't necessarily work on the level that they work in Japan. Right? Even Fate Grand Order is a good example, right? Where we're talking about a $1 billion franchise, but vast majority of that is Asia, and vast majority of that is still Japan.
And in terms of the success of some of the titles with respect to the popularity of the anime, does that roughly match? Would you say that what you're seeing from a video consumption perspective, is Dragon Ball, because Dragon Ball Dokkan Battle is popular here, that the game is popular? I'm just trying to compare the video and the anime popularity to the game success.
Certainly. I think IP recognition is huge, right? I mean, I think it's hard to look at, say, the literal popularity of the IP at this moment in time, because then you can sort of say hey, Dragon Ball and say some of the other more recent titles are as relevant. But the reality is Dragon Ball as an IP has been in the US for decades, right? And more so than just being popular on streaming, it's been on television, right? It's been dubbed into the English language. It's a world-renowned very few anime IPs have hit that kind of threshold, right? Maybe Sailor Moon, maybe Cowboy Bebop that have all aired in the US, but Dragon Ball is also really, really long running, right? And so that entire franchise and the recognition certainly helps carry a tremendous weight for audience expectations in the West.
So how are you guys from a Crunchyroll perspective, because you guys have relationships, you guys have a lot of, access to anime fans. How are you viewing the opportunity for anime-based games here in like the US or Western markets and outside of Japan? How are you guys thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think really we got into the space because we recognized that there wasn't enough of these games that were coming through. And we wanted to sort of figure out how to leverage both our relationships in Japan and our current kind of reach and engagement to the Western base to figure out how to bring more games through, right? Like we sort of went into it knowing that it's not really like a bullet, right? It's going to be pretty hard. And it's primarily a way to add more value to our fans. So right now, our current approach is look at what games have been successful in Japan and identifying the developers and the publishers that may be willing to make tweaks or make live ops adjustments to orient that game more towards a Western fandom, and then working with them to publish the games here. And that being said, I think that's still difficult because most developers don't like to maintain multiple versions of a game, right? If you have to change like the balance of the game or change even the drop rates, that could require two separate databases and live operations teams. So we are looking into more around taking the Japanese game and just doing a completely US port instead of launching the Japanese version here.
And when you think about, like, let's say you're taking, so I guess there's one part, which is taking an existing Japanese anime IP game and kind of converting it, porting it for the US audience. And then just as a standalone title, like a for the West title, that's an anime-based game. What would you say, if you're thinking about the critical success factors, or what are the key things that you need to get right in order for that game to be successful in the West? How would you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. We've often had this conversation with a lot of our Japanese partners and figuring out, what IPs work well and not. I think one is the depth of the game mechanic needs to be well thought out. There's actually quite a few anime games in Japan that are very beautiful in terms of how they are crafted and their art styles, but the game isn't that deep, right? And so you're essentially relying on IP recognition. And that's not going to work here, right? And so you can potentially push through the initial fold by getting a lot of users in, but if the game is not deep, if there's no long-term replayability, especially in the end game state, then people are not going to stay. So end game is something that we really kind of hone in on with our partners. The second piece a lot is the cadence of live ops, right? And understanding that, like, if you're an anime game player in the West, chances are that you're probably an anime fan, and a lot of the fandom here, because it's still seen as relatively niche relative to some of the other broader segments, a lot of the players are pretty avid. They're pretty avid fans, right? And so they consume the content and they consume the actual game content pretty rapidly. And so if you're going by a slower cadence of like, one new update a month or one new update every other month, like it doesn't really jive as well here because people consume all that content and they get bored and they drop off, right? And so that's really prevalent in the way that you see a lot of games that go from Japan to the US. There's a pretty big drop off in DAUs, MAUs, and retention, right? Even though it's the same mechanics. And it's not because somehow the game is bad, but it's relative to the other games in that competitive market, right? So that's a lot of what we talk about with our partners.
Yeah, so it sounds like there might be a couple of things at play here. So first is, to your point, like the anime audience has this expectation in terms of content consumption. So to your point, you need a higher cadence of content, but maybe also because they're anime fans, do you also think that they also would have an expectation for more narrative, more story, more focus on characters and things like that? Are there like specific narrative and gameplay types of impacts that you think are there because of that audience?
I mean, I think that's certainly true. I do think to that end, most decent Japanese anime games I've seen do make a pretty good effort around crafting a structured narrative, partly because they also have to, because they have to get sign off from the original IP holders.
Ah, right, right,
And we've experienced this thoroughly around like when we're trying to work on a game and we really want to work on another IP. Sometimes ironically, it's actually easier to try to fold that IP in as a collaboration instead of making a game around that IP. Because when it's a collaboration, the IP holder knows that it's non-canon and they care less about exactly what you do. They have some rough guidelines. But if
right.
you're trying to make a game of the IP, all of a sudden they care a lot about like, what are you actually making my characters do? What is the actual nature of the storyline? How is it going to impact the rest of the universe? So there is a good degree of control there.
I see. And then would you say that just also the kind of second audience kind of factor to keep in mind would be just the Japanese audience versus the US audience? And I think certainly at the high level, it seems like Japanese have a stronger preference for RPGs and more gotcha collection. US tends to favor more I guess micro-based games, more FPS and things like that. Do you see any other like kind of like high level differences between the audiences that you would try to factor in when you're taking like a Japanese game and bringing it to the West?
In general, there's a lot more potential for casual-based games in the anime space, and they do ring true in the Japan market, right? There's a lot more effort to make a broader set of game genres off of the anime space. But I think to the point you're making, like because of the nature of the anime industry in the West, at least at this point in time, the games that ultimately become successful here have to cater to a pretty like avid fan base. So they actually err on the side of being more RPG driven in order to capture the user base here.
Right.
And also because there is an abundance of all these other games that are non-anime based for all these other categories, it becomes very difficult, for example, to launch an anime based match 3 or card game here, just because the competitive landscape here for those genres is pretty well established and there's no narrative component, right? And so to your point, like if you want to rely on, nostalgia and recognition and the desire to participate in the narrative, RPGs are generally the easiest genre to go into. And I think that's why we see a lot more of that.
Got it. And then maybe kind of shifting gears a little bit in terms of the audience. And so I think that as far as the anime audience is concerned, you guys as Crunchyroll should have a lot of understanding of who that audience is. Could you talk to us about, what does that demographic look like? Is it young males? Is it a broader audience? Who are the fans of anime from a Crunchyroll perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that part probably doesn't really come as a surprise, but it's going to be more male than female. Like I would say it's probably majority male, especially the ones that play the games, right? But even within the viewership space, it is skewed a little bit towards more towards male. But the age range is actually fairly broad. I mean, certainly it skews younger, but it's broader than most people would think, right? We go upwards to like the late 30s in terms of people who are still fans of consistently watching anime. And as you can also probably imagine, the subscriber base versus the free viewer base, the subscriber base skews a little bit older. They tend to be more people who are more established, right? They have an income, they can actually afford a subscription.
Got it.
So that's kind of like the centric format. And then for us, we're global, but most of our audience data is centered around English-speaking world, right? And we're working towards expanding the rest of Latin America and European bases, but those areas are still growth mode for us.
Okay. And then can you speak to kind of maybe some of your thoughts in terms of the existing big anime games out there, like kind of your thoughts on them? And then from a Crunchyroll perspective, what are you guys planning to launch soon?
Yeah, I mean, you noted like, Dragon Ball is doing really, really well. And I think that actually captures a lot of the things that we were talking about earlier about why. I think they have really high production. They have a lot of good game mechanics, and like the core loop is actually pretty strong. It's well built, and they consider the concept of having a pretty long tail, kind of deep end game state. And so beyond that, I mean, I think there's few other games that have that big of a reach. You can reach back to like Pokemon, but that's really based on the IP and the novelty of that format. What we've been looking at these days is looking at the top 10 charts of Japan and seeing which of those games have actually also done well in the rest of Asia outside of Japan, right? So that's a first proxy for us to say, like, can it do well in a space where this IP is not immediately recognizable, right? And then it gives you a signal that the game quality itself is good. And then the second piece that we look at is we actually have started honing in on IPs that are more anime look and not based on a specific IP, because we think there's more room to grow there. And what we've discovered with all of our experiences here at Crunchyroll is that people love that genre because of the potential for the narrative and the art style that comes with it, right? People are willing to pick up a new IP. People are willing to pick up a new storyline. And so a lot of times it's actually easier to work on a game that is not based off of an anime originally, but the art style is just very reminiscent. And then eventually we actually convert that to anime. So that's sort of where our core focus is right now.
Got it. Okay. And do you have anything that you can announce, or is that kind of TBD? You guys are gearing up for some stuff, but can't announce anything just yet.
Well, what I can say is we've got a couple of original titles that are coming through towards the later half of this year. They're more working with smaller studios that we find to be very up and coming. What I can say is that we have a major tentpole game coming through. It's one of the top 10 Japanese games today that we're looking to bring to the US and the Western market probably towards the end of this year or beginning of next year. Unfortunately, I can't disclose it just yet because it hasn't been public, but it is basically something that the entire Crunchyroll team has been focusing on.
Okay, maybe I could ask you just one last bonus question, which is a little bit of a fuzzy question, but so you came from Riot. Certainly Riot is a company that is known for having incredible characters and game IP, and kind of coming to Crunchyroll and looking at anime IP. Can you talk about maybe some of the lessons learned from Riot and kind of lessons learned at Crunchyroll thinking about IP? Like how do you increase the value of these IPs, or how do you make them valuable to players or make them work in games? I kind of a fuzzy question, but wondering if you could speak to that, just given that you're coming from, you're in a role both at Riot and here at Crunchyroll where you have to think about IP very, very carefully.
Yeah, it's interesting that the two companies, they both have a very strong kind of sentiment around IP quality, but they approach it in different directions. And I actually think it creates two very different like rule sets and universe sets, right? At Riot, a big part of the opportunity was figuring out what additional ways to kind of expand a brand and IP beyond just a game, right? Especially as I was working with the China market, there was a lot of desire from our partners there to really figure out how to do more with the IP into other media avenues, right? But what's interesting is that the fandom built around that IP was largely due to the engagement with these characters and with the art styles, right? Like for a while, there wasn't as much background narrative on the characters. Now, certainly Riot went through a huge effort to build a universe around the entire character set and all the regions and Runeterra. But at the end of the day, they had a little bit more, I consider that they had a little bit more flexibility and creativity in figuring out how to, looking at how fans engaged with a particular character or a particular set of regions, it gave them a sense of like what they could do to further carry that kind of engagement by crafting a narrative that really pushed that kind of envelope, right? Whereas I think at Crunchyroll, where I draw the lesson is that helps us think about original IP in a much more holistic way, right? Like we don't have to just rely on what's coming out of an existing anime, right? Which has a lot of rules and constraints. Like if we think about a game, if we think about our original productions, which Crunchyroll is doing, there's a lot more cues that we can take from our fans and how they currently engage with various IPs, characters, narrative storylines, and draw inspiration on that to create a more holistic IP experience for our fan base. So I think, long story short, the biggest lesson I've taken away is your fans can become a big part, and your user base can become a big part of seeing ideas, inspiration, and goodwill towards how you even structure and create the ongoing IP.
Got it. All right. Yeah, and I know Riot's definitely, that's one of their strengths, right? Listening to their player base and incorporating feedback. But okay, cool. I mean, those are all the questions that I have. Do you have any like final message for anyone in our audience? If there's somebody looking, maybe you guys are looking for specific roles to fill, or if you want us to watch out for a next big game, please let us know.
Definitely a few things, right? I mean, I think definitely keep up to date with the Crunchyroll Games kind of social posts. We do have some huge announcements coming up, so that we're super excited. I super wanted to be able to share this, but I couldn't clear it with our partners in Japan because they wanted like a day and date kind of announcement. But yes, we're also rapidly growing. So a big part of what I've learned is that the gaming community, especially the anime gaming community, is small and they're very cohesive. So anytime people have good ideas, suggestions, we're always open to listening and chatting.
Got it. And maybe the final question, do you in particular have a favorite anime that you would recommend the audience to watch?
I definitely do. I mean, I don't know how broad the base is. So I really like Hajime no Ippo. It's a boxing anime, primarily because I also like boxing, and it's not a super long series. The first iteration was around 70-ish episodes. It's super good, and it's super inspirational. If you like sports or if you like inspirational stories, it's a really feel good anime with a lot of boxing sports action.
All right. Well, I think that's it. Thank you very much for your time, Terry. And yeah, appreciate all the responses to the questions. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Joe.